Okay, sorry about that. On that cap rate table, there was a problem with one of a different microphone being on. That's causing the noise in the background. I got rid of that. Okay, so this is for the basic venture capital formulas. And we'll go through the first problem and then we'll do a separate video on the other ones. Okay, so basic is this. Consider the situation of a venture capitalist who is contemplating a $3.5 million investment in a company that expects no further capital through the 5 years, year five, which basically for cash flow purposes, they're talking about you invest 3.5 million up front and you don't have to contribute any additional cash throughout the first 5 years, which means it's not a multiple cash flow problem. So you don't have to use the cash flow function on your calculator. Okay, the company is expected to earn $2.5 million in year five and should be comparable to companies commanding a price-earnings ratio, PER, of 15. So remember, the earnings in year five means that's what its profits will be. That's what its earnings are in year five. What you do typically to figure out what the stock price of a company is, it's its current earnings times a price-earnings ratio. And usually it's by industry. Sometimes it's by growth rate. So there's typical price earning ratio for an industry, or you can base it on the growth rate. If it's got a 15% year growth rate, and then it might be 15 to 30, depending on whether you go 1 to 2 times the growth rate for the price earnings ratio. I sent you that email talking about price earnings ratio and price earnings growth ratio. I think it was called PEG. So price earnings ratio is a way to price out a company pretty simply based on its year, whatever earning year you're talking about. In this case, it'll be for year five because they're basically trying to find out what the value of the company will be worth at year five. So if it's got $2.5 million in earnings, you multiply that times 15, that's $37,500,000 is what the company should be worth at the end of 5 years. Okay, the venture capitalist expects to harvest his investment at that point, at the end of 5 years, through the sale of his stock to an acquiring company. Assume further that the VC requires a 50% projected internal rate of return on the project of this risk. What price should he pay for it now? So you write down the different facts. He wants a 50% IRR, which is basically the same in this case as a discount rate. That's the type of return that he requires. Okay. He's going to invest $3.5 million, so that will be the present value of his investment. The term will be for 5 years. Okay. And then at the end of 5 years, the company will have earnings they're projecting at 2.5 million, and with a 15 price earnings ratio, you just take the price earning ratio applies to, usually it's either current years or they'll save whatever year, next year's earnings or whatever year's earnings, but you take the price earning ratio times the earnings, and that gives you what the value of the company should be. So first they said you just write down the facts. Okay, second, the venture capitalist must own enough of the company in year five to realize a 50% annual return on his investment. Thus, at the time his shares must be worth. So basically, they want to figure out what his investment should be worth 5 years at 50% return. So you can either take 1 plus the rate of return, which is 50% to the fifth power, times his 3.5 million, or you can go into your calculator, clear second value, clear down here. I'm going to back this up a little bit. So it's 5 years, so 5N, 50 interest rate, and he's got $3.5 million, right? So current value, 3500000, we'll make it negative. Present value, compute the future value, and that needs to be worth 26. They got 26.6 million, 26,578,000. Okay, so the simple his investment is present value. The interest rate is 50%. That's what he's requiring. Discount rate, whatever you want to call it, over 5 years. What's the future value, right? So now you've got what his investment needs to be worth. Okay, now at that point, you also need to know what the company's going to be worth. Okay, so we talked about that before. It's his earnings in the year 5, because that's when the company's going, or he's going to sell his portion of it, times the price earnings ratio. So 2.5 million times 15, 37.5 million. That's they call it the terminal value. Okay, so remember that term, terminal value. And the expected future value of his investment. Okay. So now on page 2 it says, calculate the percent of the company the investor must own to get his return. So we know that he's requiring it to be worth $26.6 million, and the value of the company is going to be $37.5 million. So you just take 26.6 million divided by the 37.5 million. He would need to own 70.9% of the company. And they're just basically talking about that right now. For the VC to receive the required 26.6 million in year 5, and we know the terminal value was calculated by the earnings for year 5 times the price earning ratio, so that got us 37.5 million. For this 26.6, we just figured out the future value of his $3.5 million investment in year 0 for 5 years at 50%. Okay, you just divide this by that, and that gets you the final percent of ownership, which is 70.9%. They use, required future value investment, which was the 26.6 million, right? Total terminal value, 37.5 million. Okay, and then that figures out what percent that he's going to own, which is 70.9%, right? So they're just talking about how you figure out the required future value, which is just, you can use a calculator, or it's 1 plus the rate of return to 5 years times what he was investing initially. And this is the total terminal value is just the price earnings ratio times what its income, or its net income, or, in year 5, its earnings. That gets you 37.5 million. So it's the same thing. Alternatively, what they're saying is you can take his investment in year 0, that's the present value of that, and then go back and find what the discount, the terminal value, that 37.5 million, divide it by 1 plus the 50% over 5 years, which basically all you're doing is taking the 37.5 million. Okay, let's clear this second FV. Clear down here to clear the thing. So 37, okay, excuse me, 5 years. So we're discounting it back 5 years at 50% IY. The future value is 37,500,000. Put a negative. Compute the present value. Why didn't do that? I don't know. I screwed up. I didn't put any of the numbers in. Oh, because I hit second FV instead of compute. I've done that before. That was my mistake. Okay, so 5 years, right? 50%, 50 IY. Future value is 37,500,000. 37,500,000. We'll make it negative. Future value, compute present value, 4,938,271. So basically, we took that 37 million, that terminal value, 37.5, and discounted it back to a present value. So now these are both present values, and that tells you, that gets you the same percentage. So if you discount the terminal value back, it also gets you the same percentage that you have to own. One, you're taking this initial investment and going forward to get the future value to match a future value, which is the terminal value. So future value over future value, present value over present value. They're both for the same things, and it both comes out at 70.9%. So don't get confused by that. That's just what they're trying to show you. Okay, so computing the shares to issue and the share price. Okay, so this says that when a venture capitalist invests in a company, additional shares are issued, just like when we did the cap table. Diluting the ownership of the previous investors. That's really important. The previous investors get diluted, their ownership, from 100% to whatever. In this case, they had the venture capitalists had 70.9%, so the initial previous investors would have 29.1% ownership, right? Okay, so note that the percent ownership refers to the portion of the total stock that is owned after the new shares are issued. So he's going to own 70.9%. So ownership acquired, 70.9% over the new shares divided by the equals the new shares divided by the old shares plus the new shares, which makes sense. He'll own the new shares. The new shares got added to the old shares, so these two are total shares. So new shares divided by total shares equals the amount that owner should equal the same percentage of the ownership, which is 70.9%. So what they're saying is when you take the number of shares that he's going to have divided by the old shares plus the new shares, it should equal 70.9%, which is his ownership. Another way the formula it says can be solved is determine the new shares is the number of shares to be issued. The new shares equals the percent ownership. You have to own. You have to know the old shares, but when you think about the new shares equals his 70.9%, right? Over 1 minus, and they would have 0.291 shares, and then times the old shares. Okay, so this is basically going to give you, excuse me, this is 0.709. Percent ownership over 1 minus, oh yeah, 1 minus is ownership. So it would be 1 minus 0.709 equals 0.2910. So basically, the new ownership divided by the percent that the old guys own times the old number of shares. Let's just do it so you can see it in the example. It makes more sense. Thus, if the VC owns 70.9% of the company and there are 1 million shares outstanding before the investment, then an additional 2,433,000 shares must be issued. So this is what they're basically doing is, remember, if you divide something by the percent of the original amount, that'll give you, it was kind of like we were doing those, I'm having a problem explaining this. You're trying to find 100%. This is 70% divided by what you know is 100%. Let's just do this. 0.709 divided by 0.291 equals 2.4364. So this is the new amount of ownership, right? Percent ownership. This is what the old guys own. So you divide the new amount percentage by the old and multiply times old number of shares. So if you divide 0.709, the new ownership, divided by the old ownership, that gives you 2.4364. And it says that there are 1 million shares outstanding before the investment. So you multiply this times 1 million, right? And that gets you the 2 million, and you can do it with more decimal places. I've only got this thing going to 4 decimal places. You might want to change it to 6. 2,433,476 shares must be issued. Okay? So that is the shares that must be issued. But there were 1 million shares outstanding, right? So you have to add these two together. So there'll be 3,433,476 shares outstanding. Okay, so you can do it two different ways. The share price equals investment divided by the new shares. Okay, so 3.5 million divided by that tells you what he paid for the shares. Okay, so they're asking you to try to find the share price. So now you just found a number of shares that were issued to him. Okay, so and you know he invested 3.5 million. So 3.5 million divided by 2,433,476 shares equals 1.44. You should be able to take, let me see, 37,500,000. Oh no, that wouldn't make a difference, the term, I don't think. 3,433,476. No. Oh no, it has nothing to do with the terminal value. Okay, forget what I was saying. So anyway, to make sure to understand this, the percent of ownership that he's going to have divided by the percent of ownership, the old ownership basically, times the old number of shares. That gives you the number of shares that for the new investor, which is the 2,433,476. I apologize if that was a little confusing at the end. I got a little confused there myself. Okay.